A director mocked the wrong prisoner. What happened next changed everything he thought he knew about the world. This is a story about faith, despair, and a miracle of the Virgin Mary that astonished everyone. But before we continue, leave a comment saying where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. I'd love to see how far the miracles of the Virgin Mary are reaching. James Mitchell was 34 years old when he arrived at the Florida Penitentiary. 6 months later, regret had become a physical weight pressing on his chest. Sales manager, homeowner, fiancé, all lost because of choices that seemed small until they piled into the final disaster. But the worst part wasn't the prison. It was waking up every day without a reason. It was breathing only because his body insisted. It was on a Tuesday when Father Wilson found him sitting alone in the corner of the common room. The priest was 70 years old and had been visiting the penitentiary for 30. He had seen every kind of man. But something about James made him sit down beside him without saying a word. 5 minutes of silence. Then James spoke. "It's no use trying, Father. I don't believe in any of this. I didn't come to try anything, I just came to sit." "Why?" "Because you look like you could use some company." James let out a bitter laugh. "Company doesn't change anything." "Maybe not. But it's better than nothing." And then, without knowing why, James began to talk, 20 minutes straight, while Father Wilson simply listened. When he finished, he expected judgment. The priest placed a hand on his shoulder. "Do you want to know what I see?" "A loser?" "I see someone who's still breathing. And as long as you're breathing, there's hope." "Hope for what?" "For a new beginning." The priest took a rosary from his pocket, dark wood worn from use, and placed it in James's hands. "I don't know how to pray." "No one is born knowing, but if you're willing, I can teach you." James looked at the object, so simple. Yet something about it touched him in an inexplicable way. "Why are you doing this?" "Because 40 years ago, I was exactly where you are now, lost, desperate. Someone gave me a rosary, it saved my life." That night, James tried to pray for the first time. He stumbled over the words, forgot the sequence, started over 3 times. But he kept going. And for the first time in months, he slept without nightmares. In the days that followed, Father Wilson returned. He taught more, explained the meaning behind things. James began waking up early to pray, praying before sleeping, praying when anxiety tightened his chest. 2 months later, something had changed in his eyes. Other inmates noticed. Some made jokes, calling him St. James, but most respected him. There was something about that peace, something even the hardest men recognized as real. At night, 9 o'clock sharp, no matter how tired he was, James knelt and prayed. Richard Thompson was 48 years old with 22 years in the prison system. He had been the warden for 5 years, efficient, fair, and absolutely intolerant of manipulation. He had seen inmates try everything, faking illness, creating drama, and yes, pretending to have religious conversions to gain benefits. Richard wasn't cruel. He treated prisoners with dignity, but he had a sharp, built-in lie detector. He believed in order, discipline, and consequences. Men could change through hard work and responsibility, not through magical prayers. He had been raised Catholic but stopped going to church as a teenager. To Richard, religion was a crutch for the weak. He preferred to rely on himself. The first time he saw James was during an inspection in the East Wing, Thursday, mid-morning. Richard passed by his cell. James was kneeling, his back to the bars, completely absorbed in prayer, the rosary between his fingers, lips moving silently. Richard stopped, watched. Something about that intensity bothered him. "Mitchell?" James didn't respond. "Mitchell, I'm talking to you." Nothing. As if he were in a trance. Richard knocked on the bars with his knuckles, hard. James finally turned around, not afraid, but with that serene expression. "Sorry, Warden, I was praying. I saw that. Nice performance. It's not a performance. Of course not. You're different from the other 200 inmates who find Jesus when parole is getting close. James didn't take the bait. He just stood there with those calm eyes, and there was something about that calmness that irritated Richard deeply, as if nothing he said could shake that peace. Do you really believe praying will change anything? It's already changed everything for me, sir. Richard looked at him for a few more seconds, shook his head, and walked away. But he couldn't get it out of his mind. In the following days, every time he saw someone praying, he thought of that inmate. Every time he passed through the east wing, his eyes searched for that cell, and James was always there, always with that impossible peace. 2 weeks later, Richard had a terrible day. Administrative problems, a missing guard, a headache that wouldn't go away. He decided to take a walk. His steps led him to the east wing, to James's cell, 5:20 in the afternoon. James praying, as always, but there was something different in the air, a density, a presence. Richard stopped a few meters away, watching. And then something happened that would change everything, the scent. Roses, unmistakable, impossible. It filled the entire hallway surrounding Richard completely. He looked around, confused. There was nothing. No flowers, no cleaning product, nothing that could explain it. The fragrance was so intense it felt almost physical. Richard felt a chill run down his spine. He looked at James, who kept praying, completely unaware. Richard took a step back. The scent followed him, another step, still there. His heart began to race. This made no sense. It wasn't possible. He turned and left quickly, almost running. The perfume followed him for a few more meters, and then vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. Richard stopped in the middle of the hallway, leaning against the wall, trying to steady his breathing. What had that been? Fatigue? Was he working too much? Some neurological problem? He rubbed his face with his hands. It had to be something rational. There had to be an explanation. But deep down, a part of him he didn't want to acknowledge knew there was no rational explanation for what had happened. That night, Richard barely slept. He tossed and turned in bed, his mind returning again and again to that moment. The impossible fragrance, the peace on James's face, the sense of presence. He tried to convince himself it had only been exhaustion, stress, but the memory was too strong, too specific, too real. The next day, Richard avoided the East Wing. He didn't want to admit to himself that he was afraid of feeling that again, but he was, not afraid of danger, but afraid of what it might mean. 3 weeks after the perfume incident, something happened that would change everything. James woke up in the middle of the night, 3:15 in the morning. He didn't know what had woken him. It hadn't been a noise. It hadn't been a nightmare. It was as if someone had called his name. He sat up in bed, confused. The cell was shrouded in darkness, only the faint light from the corridor slipping through the bars. Everything was silent, and then he saw it. In the corner of the cell, a soft light began to form. It wasn't the light of a lamp. It was different, purer, almost liquid. James froze, his heart pounding. The light grew, took shape. And then she was there. A woman. Celestial blue dress, white veil, hands joined in prayer. Her face was of a beauty impossible to describe. Not ordinary physical beauty, but something beyond. Something that made James's eyes burn just from looking at her. He fell to his knees instantly. Not by conscious decision. His body simply responded to the presence. "Do not be afraid, James." The voice was gentle, but it filled the entire cell. It filled all of James. He couldn't speak. He could barely breathe. Tears streamed down his face. Not of sadness, but of an emotion so intense it had no name. "I need you to do something for me." The vision changed. James saw a girl, 15 years old, long brown hair, bright green eyes. She was laughing, happy. Then the image shifted. The same girl, but now lying in a hospital bed, pale, unconscious, surrounded by machines. You must tell him that she will be fine, but he must have faith. And then she disappeared. The cell returned to its usual darkness. James remained there, kneeling, trembling from head to toe. It had been real, more real than anything he had ever experienced. He didn't sleep again that night. He stayed awake, replaying every detail of the vision, the girl's face, the exact words he had to say. In the following days, James carried that knowledge like a weight. He would see Richard walking through the corridors, and his heart would tighten. He wanted to tell him everything, but something held him back. It wasn't time yet. Richard, meanwhile, was having ordinary weeks. He worked, went home, had dinner with his family. His life went on in its predictable, controlled routine. Emily, his daughter. She was a bright, responsible girl, the joy of Richard and Linda's lives. She had plans to study medicine. Everything was fine, until it wasn't. It happened on a Wednesday. Emily was in chemistry class when she felt dizzy. She thought it was hunger. She had skipped breakfast. But the dizziness grew worse. "Teacher, I'm not feeling well." She tried to stand, and her legs gave out. She collapsed on the classroom floor. The other students screamed. The teacher rushed to her. Emily, can you hear me?" The ambulance arrived in 8 minutes. The paramedics found her conscious but disoriented, complaining of a severe headache and nausea. Linda called Richard, who was at work. Emily fainted at school. We're at the hospital. Richard felt his stomach tighten. I'm on my way. At the hospital, they ran the first tests. Richard and Linda spent the night there waiting for results. In the morning, Dr. Patterson, the neurologist, came to speak with them. His face was serious. "We haven't been able to identify the cause, but it's serious." Richard felt the ground disappear beneath him. What does that mean? Emily worsened over the next 48 hours. The headaches became constant, unbearable. Richard was in despair. Linda couldn't stop crying. The doctors ran more tests, consulted specialists, but no one had answers. It was Monday morning when everything changed. Richard had returned to the penitentiary for the first time in days. He was in his office, staring at papers that made no sense, when Officer Davis appeared at the door. "Warden, there's an inmate asking to speak with you. James Mitchell." Richard looked up. His brain took a second to process the name. James, the inmate who prayed, the impossible scent of roses. "He said it's urgent, said he has a message for you." Richard almost dismissed it. He didn't have time for this, but something made him stand up. "Where is he?" "Interview room 3. Richard walked through the corridors. He entered the room and found James sitting there, hands on the table, face serious. "What do you want, Mitchell?" "I'm sorry about your daughter, Warden." Richard froze. "How do you know about my daughter?" "The Virgin Mary showed me." "What kind of sick game is this?" "It's not a game. She came to me. She showed me your daughter." "Emily, 15 years old, long brown hair, green eyes. She showed her to me in the hospital." Richard's blood turned cold. No one in the prison knew about Emily. He hadn't told anyone, and the description was perfect. Richard sat heavily in the chair. This was impossible. "How do you know that?" "She's the one who showed me. She showed me because I need to give you a message." "What message?" James looked straight into Richard's eyes. "Your daughter will be fine, but you need to stop fighting. You need to have faith. The doctors don't know what's wrong with her. She's getting worse by the hour." "I know. And it's going to get a little worse before it gets better. But it will get better, the Virgin Mary promised." Richard felt anger explode inside him. "You're telling me that one of your hallucinations promised my daughter will live?" It wasn't a hallucination. It was real, more real than anything in this world. "Pray, even if it's just once. Even if you don't believe, just try." Richard stood up. "You're insane. Completely insane." He went back to the hospital, his mind in chaos. He found Linda in the hallway, her face devastated. "She's worse, much worse." Richard held his wife. They entered the room together. Richard approached the bed. He held his daughter's hand. "Please," he whispered, "please don't leave me." And then it happened. The scent. Roses, exactly like in that prison hallway, but stronger this time. Impossible to ignore. It filled the entire room. Richard looked at Linda. "Do you smell that?" "What?" "The smell. Roses." Linda frowned. "There's no smell here." But there was. Richard knew there was. It surrounded him completely. Impossible. Inexplicable. Real. The scent grew stronger for a few seconds, and then began to fade, slowly, like smoke carried away by the wind. Richard stood there, frozen, his heart pounding uncontrollably. "Richard, are you all right?" Linda held his arm. I don't know." Richard didn't know how to explain it. How could he tell his wife that an inmate had seen a vision of the Virgin Mary that predicted all this? How could he say that he had felt an impossible fragrance that no one else could smell? That night, alone in the room with Emily while Linda slept in the waiting room, Richard did something he hadn't done in 30 years. He knelt. He didn't know the words. He couldn't remember the prayers. But he clasped his hands, closed his eyes, and prayed. And when Richard opened his eyes, he felt something different. Not peace. He was still terrified. But there was something there, a tiny spark of hope that hadn't been there before. He sat in the chair beside the bed, held Emily's hand, and waited. The hours dragged on. Richard didn't sleep. He just watched the monitors, every beep, every line on the screens. 3 a.m, then something changed. Emily's temperature began to normalize. Richard looked at the monitor, thinking he was imagining things. He stood up, went to the hallway, and called the nurse. "Her temperature is stabilizing." The nurse came in, checked the monitors, then verified manually with a thermometer. "You're right. This is unexpected." "That's good, right?" "Yes, but we need to see if it holds." It held. By 5 a.m, Emily's temperature was almost normal. Dr. Patterson arrived at 9 for the morning rounds. He looked at the monitors with disbelief. This doesn't make sense. At 11 a.m, Emily opened her eyes. "Dad?" Richard nearly fell off his chair. "Emily, you're awake!" Linda ran into the room, drawn by the noise. When she saw Emily awake, she collapsed into tears. Dr. Patterson quickly examined Emily and ordered new tests. 2 hours later, he returned with the results in hand and an expression Richard had never seen before. "She's cured." According to the tests, yes. "It's as if she never had anything. I've never seen anything like it." Emily was discharged the next day. The doctors wanted to keep her longer for observation, but every test came back perfect. It was as if the past few days had never happened. In the car on the way home, Emily spoke. "Dad, I had a really strange dream." Richard looked at her through the rearview mirror. "What dream?" "There was a lady. She was beautiful, wearing a blue dress. She held my hand and told me I was going to be fine." Richard almost drove off the road. Linda looked at him. "Richard, watch out!" He couldn't respond. That night, after Emily went to bed and Linda had fallen asleep, Richard sat alone in the dark living room. His mind replayed everything. The vision James had seen, the fragrance, the impossible recovery, Emily's dream. There was no rational explanation. None. For the first time in his life, Richard considered that maybe, just maybe, there were things beyond his understanding. He went back to the prison, walked straight into the interview room, and asked them to bring James. When James entered, Richard didn't say anything for a long moment. He just looked at the man who had changed everything. "She's fine," Richard finally said. "The doctors can't explain it, but she's completely healed." James smiled. "I know. The Virgin Mary always keeps her promise." Richard rubbed his face. "This changes everything, everything I ever believed. You don't have to change everything at once. You just have to accept that there's something greater. Richard stayed silent. Then he reached across the table. "Thank you for praying for my daughter, for not giving up even when I treated you badly." James shook his hand. "I didn't do anything. It was all the Virgin Mary." "Even so, thank you." Richard left that room a different man from the one who had entered. In the following weeks, subtle changes began. Richard stopped mocking those who prayed. He went back to church the next Sunday, sat in the last pew, uncomfortable, not knowing what to do. But he went back the next Sunday, and the next. James was released 4 months later. His parole hearing was unanimous. Richard wrote a detailed letter of recommendation. On the day James was released, Richard was at the gate. "Good luck out there." "Thank you, Warden." "Richard, you can call me Richard." James smiled. "Thank you, Richard. Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Faith. Does it always come so easily to you?" "No. There are hard days, days I doubt, days I'm afraid. But I choose to believe even on those days, and she always shows me it's worth it." "How do I do that, choose to believe?" "You've already started, when you knelt in the hospital, when you asked for help. When you opened your heart to the possibility, that's already faith." Richard reached out his hand again. "If you need anything, a letter, a reference, anything, call me. I'll remember." James walked through the prison gates, free for the first time in years. Richard watched until he disappeared from sight. And you? Do you believe in the miracles of the Virgin Mary? Write in the comments. If this story touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell to receive more stories about the miracles of the Virgin Mary, and share this video with someone who needs to renew their hope today. May the Virgin Mary continue to bless and protect you and your family. Amen.